Yesterday, the Prime Minister went to a bottle factory and he was talking about the safe ground for him of getting violent crime down. And it seemed in just the course of one day he had gone from being an international colossus striding the world stage and getting a plucky band of rebels together against the evil empire of the White House to fight for truth, freedom and free trade around the globe. It was a strategy that seemed to come as a surprise to our Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, who twice admonished him quite clearly from his trip to the Pacific and Hawaii. We had Todd McClay, the Minister of Trade, on yesterday trying to hose the whole split down. But now we see speculation from member of the Fabian Society and government-funded journalist Richard Harman that perhaps Winston Peters is starting to destabilise the coalition, starting his election campaign. All this comes as the Green Party willfully ignore one of the most outrageous scandals in the history of New Zealand politics, certainly the most outrageous and perhaps the most questionable activity I've ever seen in my 40 years as a political journalist. And the world is burning. Australia's just done a beef deal with China because they're not going to take American beef because of the trade war. And really, it seems everywhere the world is in flux and full of uncertainty. What the hell is going on? How do we make sense of it? And what might happen next? Best person for me to talk about, and I said this interview comes about from just being on the phone with my next guest yesterday. I think, geez, it'd be interesting if other people could listen to the conversation we're having. A warm welcome to Bow Valley Road's Chris Trotter, long-term lefty political commentator and columnist. Chris, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, thank you, Sean.
It was so good talking yesterday and trying to get some sanity in a world that seems to be going mad. Would you agree there, here in New Zealand and around the world, I don't know, we're at a time of change. We're at some, maybe a tipping point.
Oh, yes. I don't think there's any doubt of that. And yesterday, I quoted Dr. Heather Smith, who's one of the senior figures in Australian national intelligence affairs. And if you'll bear with me, I'll just
absolutely.
Just repeat, repeat a little of it again. It's quite a large quote, but here's what I took to be the really sobering sentences. Quote, "We are in uncharted waters. It will be lonelier and more fraught for Australia in this multipolar world, as demonstrated by both the US and China having engaged in economic coercion against us. To say that Australia is not well positioned is an understatement. It's a dog-eat-dog world, but our political and some of our bureaucratic class are largely admiring the problem. So the biggest challenge to overcome is the inability of our political class to position Australia for this new world." Now, I think what goes for Australia probably goes double or triple for New Zealand. And I think the spat between Winston Peters and Christopher Luxon was emblematic of the difficulties that Heather Smith alludes to. And much as I'm an admirer of Winston Peters, I think he was wrong in this respect. I think Christopher Luxon had by far the more positive and sensible approach, because it seems to me that Winston is living in the past. This was brought home to me by the fact that he sort of did a tour of the World War II sites in Honolulu, the site, of course, of the Japanese surprise attack in 1941. And he seemed to be living in that world as if FDR was still the president rather than Donald Trump. And FDR is long dead, and so is the world
still, I guess,
that he created.
Look, I've talked, I remember having a conversation with Ian Templeton, and you'll know Ian, a long-time journalist and a bloody good journalist. Talking to him about this a few years ago, he says, I remember, Sean, and we were sitting actually at Port Nicholson Yacht Club, I think, having a drink or a lunch. And he said, I can remember when this harbour was full of Marines, American Marines, training, who went off and spilt their blood all through the Pacific to stop us being invaded. And I think for Ian and people of Ian's generation, that gave us an obligation or a bond with the United States that was pretty hard to break.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, over the years, I've written a great many pieces on New Zealand's foreign affairs and trade. And I have always been very, very careful to recall those moments in the early 1940s when this country's future was decided, not by the Royal Navy, the two great warships, Prince of Wales and what was it, the Repulse, were sunk in minutes by the Japanese, one after the other. And that was Britain's only answer to the threat that was posed by Japan at the time. And it was the United States Navy, first in the Coral Sea and then at Midway, that saved New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it's really, really important to remember that. But in a sense, that is why I was so pleased to hear Christopher Luxon put forward the ideas.
I also want to say, Chris, let's go back another chapter in history. Why were Japan being aggressors? Because they were being squeezed out on trade by the United States that was trying to control their economic development by starving them of oil and resources.
Ooh, that's a fairly revisionist position there, Mr. Plunket.
Come on.
No, come on. Let's have the real history here. The United States imposed an oil and scrap iron embargo on Japan because Japan was butchering millions of people in China. That's why it imposed the embargo. Not out of some
isn't that funny?
Like,
isn't that funny that the United States was protecting China and now they're at war with them? How do we mess that up? We are talking to, I think, the country's leading political commentator and certainly one of the most experienced, Chris Trotter. We've been talking about the global kind of zeitgeist at present, which seems to be a return by the Americans to a form of isolationism and what our response should be. But at home, we've also got issues, and the dispute, if you like, over trade and everything, and I don't think they can deny that they're not on the same page here, between Winston Peters and Chris Luxon. Chris also represents that what the Greens would call the imported bad faith culture wars are very much in play here in New Zealand in politics and are having an influence on political debate and developments in this country.
Well, yes. I must say, however, that the Greens are facilitating those culture war debates with great energy.
Yeah, so they're crying wolf essentially here. Oh, but they're the people who imported the crazy ideologies that have got so many New Zealanders worried. Let's be frank.
Yeah, and I think New Zealanders are also worried by the very unusual people who seem to have been selected for winnable positions on the Green Party list. I mean, I think that's a source of concern for many New Zealanders.
Well, let's not pussyfoot around, Chris. Have you ever, in your experience, in your lifetime, seen anyone have such a brass neck that they survive the revelations and even the reaction to the revelations that Bussy Doyle has in the last 3 weeks?
Well, the observation I would make in relation to Mr. Doyle is that if something of the sort had happened 20 years ago, he would no longer be a member of Parliament. And I say that because 20 years ago, we had a news media which, upon receiving the information that was put out into the public domain over the last few weeks would have been relentless in its investigation. And knowing that such a relentless investigation was bound to ensue, the leaders of the Green Party would have, I think, prevailed upon Mr. Doyle to resign from Parliament to save not only the Greens, but himself in many respects, because
I also think our news media would have demanded it, and they haven't. They have been running interference for the Green parties and talking up the victim narrative to the point where yesterday they were using a former researcher from the Disinformation Foundation, Kate Hanna's outfit, to come up with some ridiculous statistical story about the hate on Bussy Doyle.
Oh, look, that's right. And that is a very, very good measure of the change that has taken place in the mainstream media of New Zealand. And I can't fault your description. I think that many media outlets, mainstream media outlets, have indeed been running interference on behalf of Mr. Doyle. And I think it's largely because of the way the media has responded to this story that has allowed Mr. Doyle to pursue further his political career. Now, people could advance an argument, that's a good thing. What you've described is a wonderful thing, rather than censorious and bigoted.